very quickly, before we start, I clicked off before I said goodbye, so my apologies for that. But this topic is very important, I feel. Young people and homelessness. Please share if you can. Welcome to the guest show. Today I've got with me Phil Kerry, CEO of New Horizons Youth Club, and what we're going to be concentrating is youth homelessness. The figure is purported at the moment 136,000. I've just said to Phil before, I think it's more. So thank you for coming, Phil.
Thanks for having me on.
Why don't you tell me what New Horizons Youth Club is?
So every year, thousands of young people become homeless through no fault of their own. You've mentioned the kind of national figure. I'm sure we'll talk about that shortly. But in London, where we're based, I think last year alone, 20,200 young people approached their council as homeless. And the kind of difficult thing with young people when they become homeless is they don't meet priority need with the council. And so they're kind of over the age of 18. They're treated like an adult in many ways, but in other ways, they're treated like children. So we know that their wages will be less. The amount of benefit that they receive will also be less. And so they end up in this kind of stuck at a critical moment in their life, not getting the help that they need from the council. And so that's where we step in. But lots of young people not getting the support that they should, and New Horizon will provide that. And we do that through a range of services that are provided within the building and increasingly out of the building. So they cover for us outreach, so kind of street and prison outreach. We've got a team doing health, team supporting with accommodation and advice, and a youth work team that's sort of helping young people be young, build the skills they need for life. We've been doing that since 1967. It's grown from 4 well-meaning volunteers in the West End. Famously, John Snow, the broadcaster, was one of the first ever staff, the first ever director of the centre, and it's now grown to I think we're 62 staff, multidisciplinary team providing those services. And as we'll talk about, using the unique insights and experiences of the centre to campaign and ask for kind of changes. So when people ask me, is the centre dealing with youth homelessness, is it ending youth homelessness? Well, actually, no, it's dealing with its consequences for the most part. But there is a bit of our resource we use every year to try and get upstream and actually end it.
So I didn't tell you this before. I've done several volunteer positions in my life. And one of them was with Look Ahead. I went to volunteer and they put me in their borough high street hostel, which is for young people. I think they had about 100 young people there. And they gave me the position of resettlement worker. And as we know, for young people, there's no clearinghouse like there is. So in the end, I'm a trainer by nature. I create the training course. But I'll show you a story that disgusted me, and I told them that. The young guy there, he wasn't paying his service charge at all. He'd run up a bill of over £1,000. They said to me, "We want him out." And I said to him, I sat down with him one day and said to him, "What's the reality? You're going to get accommodation?" He said, "What about your rent?" Well, I'm going to not use the word he used, but he said, "Forget the rent. I don't care." And I said to them, "He's going to be back on the street. He'll be back." Well, of course, they can refuse. Yeah. And it is that reality that actually I contacted one landlord for 4 Eritreans.
Yeah.
And as soon as I mentioned they were in a hostel, he said, "No, I don't want them.
Right.
So what's the ease of getting these young people some sort of accommodation? I know it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely difficult at the moment. Obviously, you will know better than anyone just how deep the housing crisis is, but it affects young people particularly difficult because if you look at, say, private rented sector in London alone, which for a lot of people who aren't housing priority need under the Housing Act will be one of the ways that you're trying to accommodate people. So in London, we've got, I think there's 40% less private rented sector now than there was before the pandemic. One of the London Council's reports has recently shown that. If you look at the kind of what young people will either be earning or eligible for in terms of housing benefit and compare that to the average price of the private rented sector in London, I mean, it might as well not exist for a lot of young people. So one of the only routes out of the place at the moment is through supported accommodation. And a lot of young people either don't need that kind of support, or you get in a kind of trap of getting stuck in supported accommodation with the service charges and high levels of rent, not being able to work then without triggering kind of big service charge debts. So there are a number of kind of challenges presenting at the moment. But one of the things I would always say, young people are unbelievably resourceful and they're very focused on their futures. So the centre, there's a lot of kind of difficult things that happen at the centre on a daily basis, and increasingly we're getting lots of young people coming through the door, highest levels we've ever seen. But there is always a sense of hope and always a sense of possibility. And one of the values we talk about New Horizon is determination, because actually the young people are very determined to get on, and we are very determined to find a way. There is always hope, there is always a possibility, and it's just about kind of getting behind what the solutions are.
Yeah, you said supported housing. I'm thinking about the law for young people, anybody under 35 really, is their housing benefit is really what they call shared accommodation.
Yeah, and kind of universal credit, they get 26% less. Minimum wage is significantly less. And some of this stems back to, I was looking at this the other day, just in terms of history. So the original Housing Act, the Housing and Homeless Persons Act, which came on the back about 10 years after Cathy come home, the thing that kind of started to get the country talking about, do we need to think about housing in a different way? Well, at that time, quite a few people were saying, including Lord Longford, who set up New Horizon back then, former MP, social reformer, did a lot of work on prison reform. He and other lords, the Bishop of Chelmsford amongst them, were saying young people need to be priority need because they are young. They, by definition, won't have resources. They won't have a safety net. They're going to be earning less money. We need to treat them as a priority group, because otherwise what's going to happen is they're just not going to get housed and they're going to end up falling through the cracks. And actually we saw back in 1977, almost 50 years ago, that was going to happen. And that was the moment, that was the chance to change stuff. We didn't act on that. All three parties, Liberal, Labour and Conservatives, voted against it. It never made it into the Housing Act. And that's what we've been living with ever since. And that's what we're trying to change at the moment, is trying to say, well, actually, we've got to think about young people as a different group. They experience homelessness differently. And so the solutions and investments need to be different. And I think one of the most compelling bits about youth homelessness is, and lots of studies show this, including, you mentioned Crisis, a Crisis study from a few years ago, is that I think on their study, 48% of adults experiencing homelessness first did so under the age of 21. So lots of people say, and the same is true with government rough sleeping statistics, over half of rough sleepers first did so under the age of 25. If we want to get serious about ending homelessness in this country, we have to get serious about ending youth homelessness first.
It's funny because I was talking to Nicola yesterday. I was mentioning I was meeting with you. She said, brilliant. But then we were talking about people under 70, under your age bracket. I mean, she said something I think is real. But a lot of people who've been homeless become acclimatized to it. They become habitual homeless people. I know a guy, when I was on the first year I was on the street, I didn't get on the street till I was in 2006, so I was around 50. This guy, during that first year, kept on disappearing. I didn't know where. Somebody told me he got accommodation, he walked out.
Right.
Now, I don't know how long he'd been homeless. People say it seemed like years. But how do you... I'm trained as a counsellor, I'm thinking of habits.
Yeah.
How do you get somebody out of the habit of thinking the street's the only world?
Yeah. Well, one thing I could tell you, and again, I'm not an expert on such matters in terms of habit forming and breaking, but habits are a lot easier to break when they're less formed. And I think that goes back to that kind of youth bit of it, is it's better to intervene when something is transitionary or happening at a particular moment in time before it becomes habitual and over a long period of time. The other academic I was talking to about this the other day, Suzanne Fitzpatrick, who's I guess one of the leading academics in the area of Heriot-Watt University, and she said there's a study that she'd also done, I think across 7 different places, I think within England, of probably a bit like the gentleman you're talking about, people who'd been rough sleeping over a long period of time. And actually, if you track back their life to younger years and ask about the sorts of things that would have happened through their life, actually there's a high degree of correlation about what happens at particular moments. And it all starts in people's late teens, sort of the 16, 17-year-old bracket that you're talking about. We start to get kind of perhaps abuse, or the family home breaks down, periods of homelessness, and the rest follows from there. So if we can intervene early, it's much better. It's better for everyone. It's cheaper, save the economy more money, but critically, we kind of save people's lives of trauma.
Trauma is a big thing in one of the couple of organisations I belong to. We talk about it quite a lot. And I'm thinking now when you were talking, it was about prisoners. I'm thinking about the guys. I knew a bloke in the East End, because I come from Whitechapel, who every so often would go inside. It's part of it, as far as he's concerned, that's part of the risk of nicking. Yeah. That was his job. But some of them going to prison because it's the only place they feel okay in.
Yeah, and that's just a damning indictment of our society, sadly, isn't it?
But I have another question. First for the youth club before we go to international. How many people come from London of your members?
So it's an evolving number, particularly at the moment, just because of what's going on with some of the Home Office asylum hotels. So typically kind of about 70% of the people coming through our doors would have been from London. So if you imagine we're based in Camden, we would consider ourselves a pan-London service. And if you imagine a heat map, the closer you are to that area, North London, you'll get more, but then South London, East London, then the rest of the country, and then the rest of the world. I think my first year here, I think we had as many as 67 different countries of origin coming through the doors. So, and including last week, a young man who'd come from Chad, undocumented, I think had come here and realised actually this wasn't the life for him and wanted to go back. But where the spikes and where the numbers have really been changing, and I do always think this with the centre, you almost watching in real time what's playing out in the world a couple of weeks later, walking through our doors almost. So I don't know if you're aware, Ian, that the Home Office have made a kind of fairly unilateral decision that they want to close the asylum hotels and process everybody at speed. And I don't think anyone disputes that we want to kind of get people's claims sorted out. There's a massive backlog of 150,000 people. It's the speed at which it's being done with such a lack of housing. And that has led to high numbers of newly granted refugees becoming homeless, and often street homeless at a critical point, and actually through this winter in a very dangerous way. So what we've seen at the centre more recently is huge numbers of people who are sort of newly granted indefinite leave to remain. So we've got lots of you mentioned Eritrea, got lots of Eritrean, Sudanese, Iranian, Afghani young men coming through the door. And that has changed the profile of the centre and the work that we're doing in more recent months.
Well, it happens. Yeah, I had a friend of mine works for Emmaus. He was a rough sleeper. He's now in a senior position, but he does work in the advice area as well.
Yeah.
And and I did do an episode I called the migrant eviction. And he was telling me about some of them only given 7 days notice to leave the hotel.
Yeah, that was happening before Christmas. Yeah, I mean, thankfully they've pushed it back to 28 days now. And I know the homeless sector is pushing for 56 days for a bit more space. Well, to slow it down a bit, but to give councils more of an opportunity to work with people before they're let out of their hotels, basically, so that there is a chance to kind of relieve.
On a side note, I was at a meeting, must have been about 5 years ago. I used to write for the Pavement magazine.
Yep.
And I went to a meeting at the GLA, and they had most of the homeless organisations there. And everybody was saying, look, having somebody in a shelter for 30 days is not long enough. We need that 56 days. Because even then, I don't think it's long enough.
No, but it's better than nothing.
Better enough, but nothing's been done. Yeah.
That's what we run with the pool and in partnership with the GLA and London councils. We run something called the Youth Hub, which is London's only accommodation for young people sleeping rough. So you
Oh,
can come straight from an outreach team into the Youth Hub. You can either get a referral through an outreach team or through New Horizon and the partnership we run, the London Youth Gateway, and that's a 56-day kind of ideal target stay. That's what we try and do. In reality, it probably takes into the 60s in terms of days, but it is enough time to stabilize someone's situation, maybe get some ID, start to make some housing referrals,
funny, they were
benefits.
talking about the hubs at that meeting. They were talking
Mm.
about one North London, but this is for adults. So where is this hub? Is it in central?
In Islington. It was set up in the pandemic as a pilot. It was a 40-bed in Hounslow. It's worked really well. I think only 2% of people have returned to the streets after staying there. So it's been a really good model. We're trying to open a second one. I mean, it's great to have 28 beds. The reality is, I think last year we had probably about 800, only kind of by official statistics, young people sleeping rough. So one of the things I found surprising joining the sector, as I did about 5.5 years ago, is that basically about 10% of all rough sleepers in the capital are under the age of 25. And you wouldn't necessarily see that as a kind of Londoner walking around the streets, because you would often think about kind of adult older males. And one of the reasons, and this is kind of comes to the heart of youth homelessness as a whole, is that young people experience it differently. So a lot of young people here, about half the people that would come through our doors are kind of rough sleeping or mixing it up with sofa surfing. And they would say, we wouldn't sleep outside a train station or in a shop doorway because we wouldn't feel safe, actually, or we wouldn't want the stigma. So they tend to do it in more hidden ways. They're less likely to show up in statistics. And because you don't show up in the statistics, you don't get the investment that other kind of forms of homelessness does. And the cycle just goes round and round. And so one of the things we've really been trying to do is to actually raise the profile of the issue, not least because of all the things I said earlier about actually this is a really good way of, we're serious about ending homelessness, is a really good way of doing it, but because often young people don't even get the proportionate level of investment. If you think about numbers of young people approaching housing options around the country, probably about 20%. Do they get the amount, and compared to other groups, do they get 20% of the investment? Absolutely no way. They get almost none. And that's what we used to have a bit more of in London, that all the kind of rough sleeping services were commissioned generically for all ages. And actually, you can't put young people in all age services. It might as well not be there for them because they just don't feel safe, quite rightly, with 50-year-old, typically men. So you have to have kind of youth specific solutions and youth specific accommodation, because as we've also talked about, the solutions that are available to young people are different because they get less benefit, less money, all the rest of it. So you need different kind of ways out of it as well.
Yeah, so I slept on a doorstep off Fleet Street, and I can understand the guys who sleep in Covent Garden.
mm. But the guys sleeping in Covent Garden, then what was the kind of age profile?
It was older, I'm talking
Yeah,
about people. Yeah. Well, it's funny, connections at one point before lockdown, I was volunteering there teaching IT. And I mentioned to somebody the young people sectors, and yeah, we used to have lots now, we don't have them anymore.
yeah.
But you brought another question for me. One final question before we go to the national picture. Sexual, male or female? What would you say it is?
For in terms of national picture or within the centre.
With the centre firstly.
I mean, it's evolved quite again. So one of the interesting things, like I said, it sort of maps out what's going on in real time. So I think pre-pandemic, we probably would have been about, if my memory serves me right, about 75%, 25% male to female split. But one of the things we saw in the pandemic was, and this sort of mirrors what a lot of kind of women's charities, domestic sexual abuse charities were saying, was because everyone was stuck at home, you were getting a lot more pressure into kind of home environments, a lot more abuse was going on, and actually therefore we saw a lot more women and young women becoming homeless. So we saw a greater number of people coming to the centre. We actually went to about 40% of users in the centre were young women, and on the back of that we set up Wednesday afternoon. So the centre's like normally always just a drop in, anyone can access on any given day, but we've now made Wednesday afternoons a women's only space, so there is a space just for young women to come in.
So it's high.
with their peers.
Average for the older age grade was about 20%, 22% women, and the rest were men. So
Yeah.
it's higher. I was
It's
wondering.
probably dropped down a bit here. So it's probably back to sort of, I think last time I looked, 32, 33%. Probably has come down a little bit. So yeah, it is. I mean, it's ever evolving, and that's one of the things that's interesting. The centre is you've got to keep your services flexible to adapt and evolve to what's happening, because homelessness is not a static thing, and youth homelessness is certainly not static. It's the demographics are changing all the time, and so this, whilst you're trying to offer open access, everything under one roof kind of approach to service, you're also trying to be able to innovate and have flexibility to cater for those who need slightly different things.
When I brought Ross on, because he's the person I want to start the whole podcast with, because I trust his information. That's why. And he was saying that 6% of the homeless in London, he looked at London, because you can get the figures in London easy.
Yeah.
6% were the rough sleepers.
Yeah.
And we know it's supposed to be 1 in 50 in temporary accommodation at the moment.
Yeah.
It is, and that's about 190,000.
Yeah.
I looked it out because it's great to say percentages all the time. I like figures. But then we've got the young people as well, part of that 6%.
Yeah.
It still is a massive amount of people. So let's look at the international picture, the national picture now. I know you're trying to promote change in the government. What's it like nationally, and what's the support like outside London for them? They've got you here.
Yeah, so I mean, luckily, there's lots of places, lots of youth homeless charities around the country. There aren't many places like New Horizon. It's fairly unique actually to have a drop-in or day centre that's focused on just on young people, and that's partly just because London's got the highest footfall, and so you can warrant the level of service that we've got for a particular demographic. But the picture really here, I mean, you're going to get variation city to city, city versus rural, etc. But the picture broadly plays out all across the country and indeed across all 4 nations. And that's one of the reasons, and the things I've been saying to you about. So I actually think London's probably more progressive than other places. The mayor, in fairness to him, has really grasped this, the GLA and London councils too, that this is an area to really invest in. What we're trying to do now is to get that a bit more better understood nationally. So I guess I'm trying to think, it's probably about 18 months ago, a few of us started to come together, us, Centrepoint, DePaul, people who sort of regularly collaborate on these things, said, look, there's a general election probably coming at some point in 2024. I think it might even be 2025 now. They'll probably drag it out as long as possible. But we're all very good. Charities as a whole, youth homelessness in particular, are asking for particular things. Why don't we all ask for one thing together and all ask for exactly the same thing? And we can agree what that is, but ultimately it came down to we need a national strategy to end youth homelessness. Let's make this a focused, targeted area, get the investment into it for all the reasons that I've been talking to you about. And actually, we want that to focus on better prevention of young people, because there's good evidence about the sorts of things that would happen in younger life in the teens that would lead to a young person becoming homeless. So better prevention, better financial security, we've talked about wages and benefits being less, and ultimately better housing. What's interesting about young people's housing is their housing costs exactly the same for young people, although their means to access it are completely different. And one of the things I remember looking at when I first started here is there's a London plan, there's a London housing plan. You look at that and talk about young people. There's mentions of students as a group. There's no mention of young people as a typology within housing. And 20% of all Londoners are aged between 19 and 29, and no one thinks about their housing. They just assume they're either going to fit into everyone else's stuff or live at home. And actually, we know that's not the case. They have less money. They probably want slightly different setups, more flexibility, perhaps less space to have their own front door. So that's one of the areas. And the campaign. So that's kind of the things we've been focusing on. The campaign was originally called A Plan for the 129K, because by Centrepoint's data, it was 129,000 young people approached their council the previous year. Midway through the campaign, they updated the data bank, and it's now called A Plan for the 136K, because there's 136,000 people approached the year after. And that's grown from, a few organisations having a conversation to, I think there's 136 different signatory organisations now across all 4 nations, all trying to get the government to take this issue a lot more seriously.
Funny, you say 136,000, you got 136.
No, I know that happened last week. So it was about 120 when we went live with the campaign in January. And then it's sort of more people have been growing, and I mean it might be more than 136 now. Seems
As
to be
I
adding
said before,
organisations.
I think there's a lot more than that. It's like street counts.
Mm.
When they announced the street, actually, you may remember when they did the Everything's All, and they said we've got so many homeless people, and they were double.
Yeah, well, DLUC would say it was less based on their data, but they unfortunately won't share our data. But we base it on Centrepoint do a brilliant data bank research every year. So they do freedom of information requests to all the councils to say how many young people have approached you as homeless. What we would say at New Horizon is that probably underplays it by a factor of 2, because our own data would suggest only 48% of the people we support approach the council because they've either been told don't bother, you're not going to get any help, or they don't know that they can. So it's a significantly bigger number, but we've latched onto that one because that's the one we've got evidence for.
Well, I have my own personal story when I came out of hospital, the difficulty I had. And it's proving your priority need that you are in need.
Yeah.
I think I feel very sorry for some housing officers because the amount of people wanting homes.
Mm.
But so we've got all these organisations. You started a petition.
We have, yes.
And how's that going, you think?
So it's going well. I think we're on 12,000 signatures or something. So we've been doing a number of different things to raise awareness of. So originally we launched and we said, this is the campaign. There's organisations calling for this. Over the summer, we've been talking to MPs. We've been meeting with lots of different MPs from all different parties, trying to kind of win support within Westminster. Keir Starmer's our local MP and came to visit in December, and we spoke to him about it. We'll talk to anyone, prospective parliamentary candidates as well. And we've been trying to build connections to people who hold sway over MPs, so people like the Children's Commissioner, other sort of parliamentary or political figures. So we've been doing that all through the summer, and then in January this year, we've launched a public-facing campaign to show that the public care about this too, and that's the petition. So we've had a lot of out-of-home, we've had newspaper adverts that we've managed to get for free, out-of-home advertising, I should say, billboards and the like, newspaper adverts. It's had lots of media. It was mentioned on The Rest Is Politics. We've had lots of celebrities endorsing it. So trying to kind of get as many people as possible talking about the issue. And I think the 12,000, we're pleased with the 12,000. Would have liked it to have been more. It's been interesting doing something like this because you can get big, high-profile things talking about it, but it doesn't always necessarily translate into people watching something, visiting a website, entering their details. So I suspect it's had a lot more exposure than it's had signatures. But
I know I've actually signed your petition 3 times. I was told I've done it too many times.
There you go. Well, I'm glad you've signed it. Very good. And I'm hoping a few people listening to this will do too.
I hope so.
There is a website. It's www.planforthe136k.org.uk, or if you look at any of New Horizons socials, it's plastered all over it.
The email of the website, please.
Yes, I will.
What I'll do is, there's a write-up for each podcast. I'll put it in the write-up.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in London, the London Assembly have now backed it, and we're waiting for Sadiq to respond to the London Assembly. So I hope he will also back it. And then ultimately, we are hoping to do a Westminster Hall debate, probably in the spring, to get some MPs along talking about the issue. And I think, the nub of this really comes down to the rock and a hard place that young people are caught between. So I think really strongly as a country, we either need to say, because basically when it's convenient, we treat young people like an adult, and when it's convenient, we treat them like a child. And we need to have a clear position on this. So we either need to say, actually, young people are young, and therefore they are priority need, and we need to make them priority need under our Housing Act, the thing that we failed to do in 1977 and have failed to do since. Or we say they're not priority need. Okay, fair enough, they're an adult. In which case, if they're an adult, we need to remove age-related benefit and wage discrimination immediately so that they get the same as anyone else over the age of 25 or over the age of 35. And we cannot exist in this position that we're in, because this is why we've got 136, probably 250,000 young people who are homeless and struggling to put a roof over their head.
Yeah, one of my little side things is I studied Native American shamanism. And one of the sayings in
That's
there,
a great side thing to have.
it's quite interesting. I learned treble lessons from it. But one of the little things they do say, a lesson that was taught by a shaman or they're medicine men, shaman are only
Hmm.
Siberians. That's where the shamans are. Is that everybody has wisdom, whatever age, and we
Yeah.
should listen to it. That's why my podcast, you probably read, is lived experience people.
Yeah.
Really keen on getting them on the more
Yeah,
than
exactly.
I don't mind yourself or like I've had Matt Downey. Actually, you're the only people so far.
Yeah.
That I would say, but still, everybody has wisdom, and maybe this is the reason why I will say that sometimes they don't. Oh, it's like, okay, I'm going to say one of my pet. Another reason for doing this podcast and get lived experience in is they're all going to think that people on the street are drinkers, druggies, or
Mm,
I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I never stole
yeah.
them. Right? I won't say that some of my guests haven't at some stage in their life, but I understand it.
Yeah.
But it's to realise that they're valuable people in society.
Yeah. People say it to me all the time with the centre, like, "Oh, is everyone on drugs here?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, I imagine, given our sort of target audience is 18 to 24, I'm sure some people are using drugs recreationally, but I think if you visited any university hall, probably including Cambridge and University, probably less than in the Houses of Parliament in some ways, actually, by the accounts you hear out of there. So,
My study partner when I was doing counselling, every time I went to her place, she lived in Camden,
mm,
and I went to her, the first thing to do is roll a joint.
mm,
So what? It didn't imbibe her intelligence or anything, but
yeah.
to realize that these people are valuable members of society and they will become valuable members of society.
Yeah, it's interesting if you debate. I find this sort of minimum wage debate fascinating and incredibly depressing. And I did a sort of joke post on LinkedIn in the new year. The darts player Luke Littler,
Yeah.
who was 16 and he sort of got to the final, didn't he? Since won tournaments, but
Hmm.
I sort of did a joke post to say, had he won, he was going to be paid 48% less than
Yeah,
had the other guy won, because he's living at home, whatever else. But and there would have been outcry if they'd paid him half the money. There would have been outcry, and yet every day young people go to work alongside adult peers doing the same job and are paid half or 20% or 30% less, and that's somehow acceptable. For reasons that are not entirely clear to me. When I've asked DWP, they say it's actually to stop discrimination, to make them more competitive in the jobs market, because people perceive that they're less valuable. And I say, well, I mean, so you're actually discriminating against people to stop them being discriminated against. And someone has said to me recently, I mean, surely under a sort of Equalities Act, these things are subject to legal challenge potentially. So maybe that's something we need to do next. I think, to be fair, both parties, and to a greater or lesser extent on the speed, have committed to phasing it out. It's just the speed at which they're doing it. They have on the wage, they haven't on the universal credit and housing benefit. And that is the bit I think we need to challenge.
well, I know that when Matt put that thing up about that housing benefit is going to be increased by 30%.
Yeah.
He put, I don't know if you saw that post. I put down, I couldn't believe it. I thought they're going to do it by the inflation rate.
Mm,
Because you may remember when they froze benefits for 5 years,
mm,
they didn't adjust it to what it should be. They
yeah.
adjusted it to the previous years. And it was, but I think that's political.
Yeah.
All this money they're throwing out at the moment is just so they believe it will win them votes.
Well,
That
it's great. I mean, it is great that it's being uprated, of course, and it's a brilliant win from Crisis and Shelter and others who've been campaigning hard for it. What I would say is kind of experience has taught us that if you tinker with one bit of the system in isolation, it has unintended consequences. So we've seen this with things like the right to buy. Housing operates in a system, and if you just simply uprate things like universal or the housing benefit element of it, what you'll probably see is landlords saying who are doing large bits of provision for supported accommodation, and kind of their customer base is reliant on using that, they will probably put their prices up accordingly, knowing that that's coming. It's like when stamp duty got removed during COVID, or got reduced during COVID. Well, everyone just put the house prices up when they were selling them to sort of bake that in. So unless it's the sort of supply demand type bits of both rental and selling houses, you have to kind of do a number of interventions across the system at once. If you just do one, the kind of market will react to that bit, and not always in the way that we want to.
well, landlords always they get access to local housing allowance.
Yeah,
They see it. It's there documented. Anybody can find what it
yeah,
is.
exactly.
And
So
what they do is they put it to that local housing allowance, right?
exactly.
But you are quite right. For young people, they get this shared. Unless they're being through the hostel system.
Mm.
Apart from that, they must go into shared accommodation. And that's about half. And usually you can't find it.
I mean, it's almost not worth having. Yeah,
Yeah.
as in it's almost, there's no point in it existing really.
I think they might as well, what I propose is they should give the young people the same housing allowance that an old person would have, an older person would have.
Yeah.
And thus, because some people don't want to share. I must admit, if I was a young person, well, the third time I was on the street, I was told by the worker at Connections, if I didn't use their night shelter, he wouldn't help me. I know he couldn't say
Mm.
that. And I just said, no, I'll sleep out in the street because I got a better sleep on the street than I did in the night shelter.
Mm.
And that's the same thing with sharing with people. You don't know who you're going to share with, even if, those Eritreans I spoke about, they knew each other.
Mm.
But then it's educating landlords as well, I think.
Yeah.
Because I would say I've written reams on the universal credit in the past. I saw an article in one thing about that this landlord said he will not accept people on universal credit. So I contacted the National Association of Landlords and
Mm.
said, "Is this a one-off?" And she said she wrote back to me. This is when universal credit had a bad reputation.
Mm.
That yes, it's everybody.
Yeah. I can imagine, yeah, and we get lots of landlords calling us up and saying, "Oh, we've got great housing and supported housing and all the rest of it," and then you say, "Oh, for young people, oh no, we don't want any young people."
Uh-huh.
The discrimination, explicit and implicit, that exists against young people just because of their age. I mean, another thing I often say, I mean, if this was said about any other demographic, ethnicity, age, or otherwise, there'd be outcry. But the things that are kind of leveled at young people just because they're young, it's disgusting, really.
Maybe you need a type of Adam Bates versus the post office. Say like, I don't know. I'm going to be racist here. Maybe I said Ali versus the housing people.
Well, yeah, or just every young person in the UK versus the government, basically,
Yeah,
of just,
should be because
yeah,
it's funny by that. There have been documentaries about what happened to post office over the 2015. I found one.
yeah.
Nothing happened. Then this television program came on. There were actors on it. It was very well done.
Mm.
It so maybe that sort of thing might be something to consider.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was talking to some colleagues about this the other day. So I mentioned Kathy Come Home earlier, which was 1967, and it took about 10 years for the Housing Act to come on the back of it. But what is less well known, and I didn't know till a few weeks ago, is have you ever heard of Johnny Go Home?
I've
You've heard
heard.
the documentary. So it was released in 1972, and I mean, I would highly recommend people watch it. It's fascinating. So it's all about young people sleeping rough in the capital, and it was done by Granada Television. They were filming different young people in what would have been called the Dilly back then, around Piccadilly, coming
Mm.
down to London, trying to make ends meet. I mean, what's fascinating is they're all suited and booted. They're all in 1970s, wearing shirts and tie, with their suitcases, navigating the streets of London, sleeping in cardboard boxes in their suits. But the numbers actually back then were very similar to what they were now. If you looked at kind of what they're talking about, it was a big peak. Um, but it was some of my colleagues here, some of the older colleagues said, "Oh, I remember it when it came out, and sort of made you worried about kind of being on the street, and you definitely wouldn't want to be homeless, kind of thing." But it never kind of took off in quite the same way. And again, it's that young people's bit. It's on YouTube, the documentary. It's fascinating.
It is because I remember that Cardboard actually did a reinvention of Cafe Come Home. They did it at a Barbican, and Ken Loach came
How did I?
to be Prime Minister in my eyes. He took apart the Deputy Mayor, about housing.
Mm,
And if you don't remember, he did something called I, Daniel Blake.
yes, yeah,
That was brilliant.
brilliant. Yeah.
As an actor, like I've written that sort of thing, I'm not famous. And also I'm lazy writing. But it's funny how what could be a drama. And when I saw that thing about the post office, I thought it was a drama at first. I
Yeah.
didn't realize it was real. And so 10, 20 minutes into it, I realized this happened.
Mm.
And it's how to do it,
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes it is the art of TV and the performing arts, isn't it, that brings something to the public consciousness. Sometimes we have the opposite, which is the kind of very tragic moment where sadly someone's died and a law is created in their name. And the thing we've been trying to think about recently is the kind of the message is clear what we're trying to do. It's you've got to get the right messenger, and sometimes that could be TV or it could be an individual, but who's the person who can take this to the
that's
public consciousness and get people behind it, an Alan Bates character on
yeah.
TV or whoever it might be.
You might even, for all you know, you might have one of your guys who come along to your centre.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
Exactly that very, but for some reason he's not recognised. Maybe he's not
Mm,
like that. Alan Bates guy sounds like a butcher. He sounds like me when I get off on one of my little things. He keeps on going on about it.
yeah.
This should happen, yeah. But he's. I have a suggestion for you.
Mm.
It's not about me. I'm not going to come on. Don't worry, because I'm too good looking. You cost.
As are we both.
Yes, that's all we've got. Um, I've always felt I was a comedian in my beginning years. I think a good comedian because humor hits home.
Yeah, I mean, someone else has actually suggested that to me in a slightly different guise because um, it was my partner actually, and she said that the world at the moment is very negative,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of kind of fighting negativity with negativity, and I think we're guilty of this as well at New Horizon, and I am individually. There's a lot of crap out there, and you sort of point out all the bad things and moan about how bad everything is. And actually, to take a change of tack, a positive one, can be kind of the sort of just the juxtaposition of humor for something that is so deadly serious can actually help carry a message across. You've got to handle these things very sensitively, but it is a way of trying to get a message across a little bit differently. So one of the campaign, if you look at the campaign film we did for the Plan for the 136K, the kind of the hero campaign we did was a short film with two TikTokers, and that was kind of funny. It was about them trying to get signatures for something that was just ridiculous. Like, why on earth do we have to get people to sign to stop young people being homeless? But we do. So trying to kind of flip things on its head, I think it's a good suggestion.
It's
So
all.
we need a young comedian who's been homeless.
I'm only 21, by the way. No, I wrote. I used to see things and think there's. I have a crazy sense of humor anyway. I wrote a piece about mobile phones. I saw two people walking down the road side by side on their mobile phones. So all of a sudden I got the addiction to mobile phones and
Mhm.
all that.
Yeah.
And those days, the minutes, you had to use the minutes you got.
Yeah.
It's looking at that, but I'm sure there'll be somebody out there that can identify, or even a director or a producer of a theatre company who might be interested, because that's for some reason that Alan Bates worked more than those. And I saw the documentaries and they were good, but nothing happened. But I'm going to say thank you very much, Phil.
Well, thanks for having me. It's I always appreciate the chance to talk about youth homelessness and take it to a wider audience, and really appreciate what you're doing as well, Ian.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now you've heard Phil Kerry. I'm going to put a link here. Send me the link for the podcast and the link to the petition as well.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to the Johnny Go Home
Yeah, I'll
documentary
be
as well, because
interested.
it's really worth
Yeah,
really
that as
worth a
well.
watch, even just the first 10 minutes.
Always wanted to call Johnny. But if you are interested, I hope you found this podcast informative. That's what I try to do in these podcasts. It's not about, like some place I see, it's ego of the presenter. I'm just trying to show you a story. I'm a storyteller. Now, if you are interested in hearing more, please email me at standupspeakoutuk@mail.com. I have a mailing list. I can add you to that. There's no charge to the mailing list. There's only charge to talk to me. So thank you very much. And